They laughed as red wine ran down her apron, gurgling a wet, shameful sound against the peach silk beneath. It happened in a fraction of a second that felt like an hour. A teenager's elbow, a careless tilt, a ripple of laughter that started small and swelled as more faces turned and phones rose. The chandeliers spilled light across the ballroom like a slow sunrise. The laughing cast their reflections in 100 polished surfaces. Aya Morton stood where she had always stood at those charity galas, hands steady, tray balanced, practiced smile in place, until a warm stain spread across her sleeve and someone hooted and the room decided she was suddenly the entertainment. The bartender's hands froze. A wine glass shattered somewhere near the orchestra pit. Preston Harrington III, 14 and flush with a family history that taught him his impulses had consequence only if someone else decided they should, blinked, shrugged, and walked away with the rest of his party. The guests laughed louder. A woman in jade earrings lifted her phone like a trophy. Aya did not scream. She did not fling her tray or fling herself at the boy. She wet a napkin at the service table and patted at the stain with the same quiet precision that had earned her nods from managers over the years. She accepted the murmured apologies from the upper tables with an evenness that people misread for fragility. Her face, brown, composed, not apologetic, became, for the next 15 seconds, a tableau the cameras did not want to look away from. Someone uploaded the clip within minutes. The first loop was sharp. The wine in slow motion, the satin darkening like a bruise, the laugh that kept compounding itself. Captions arrived in 5-second clusters. Waitress drenched at Harrington Gala, and watch how they treat the help. By the time the orchestra's encore finished, the clip had moved from private feeds into pages marked by blue verification checks, and the world watched a small, private cruelty as though it were a public event. That was the spark. Her hands shook in the staff room only once when the manager turned away. It was not for the wine. It was for the knowledge that something private had been made indelible in pixels, that strangers would feel licensed to assign a meaning to her posture or her smile. Aya thought about her notebook, thin, battered, a shopping list inside and, tucked beneath the pages, the small paper bundle Eleanor Reed had given her 2 nights earlier. "Keep these safe," Eleanor had said, and Aya had laughed it off then as the quaint concern of an elderly housekeeper who had worked for the Harringtons for 25 years. Now, as the clip began its first tidal swell online, she pulled the bundle from her bag and felt the edges like a secret between teeth. Comment where you're watching from, and subscribe for tomorrow's feature. The invitation was small and practical, meant to be said into the camera the way reporters have always asked for maps after the map has already been redrawn. Aya did not know the shape of the map yet. She did know that for 2 decades a certain kind of disdain had been smoothed over by crystalline philanthropy, and tonight the veneer had cracked. She pocketed the bundle of papers and stepped out onto the back stairs, past a corridor of portraits that had once meant something else to her. She was careful not to catch the eyes of security. They had already seen too much. Eleanor Reed smelled of starch and lemon oil and something older, mothball lavender, the smell of a woman's life spent in service. She waited in the alley by the service entrance, leaning on a cane, wrapped in a coat that had once been fine. Her hands were small but steady as she handed Aya a letter folder the size of a novel. "It came to me," she said. Her voice was thin and unshowy. "From boxes in the old safe. From the days when no one thought to look." The folder did not look like the sort of thing that toppled empires. Inside it were photocopies with handwritten notes in margins, ledgers with columns of transfers that did not add up, payroll sheets with names crossed out and rerouted payments, receipts annotated in pencil, the kind of detail that had been tallied by someone who kept a ledger of wrongs. There was a demonstrable pattern. Accounts siphoned, vendors paid twice, charitable coffers with missing line items, a repeated set of transfers funneled through shell companies with names that read like a lexicon for plausible deniability. Aya listened and let Eleanor speak. The old woman had retired her broom only when she could not lift it anymore. The rest of her days were catalogs and knots of memory. "I took down dates," Eleanor said. "Names. I wrote them in the back room ledger, so nobody would think to look at a broom closet for a balance sheet." Her hands found Aya's and closed around them. There was no performative confession, no melodramatic flourish, only the kind of tired insistence that comes when a person has watched themselves disappear into the margins of someone else's ledger and decides they are done being invisible. Hours earlier, Aya had served the Harringtons' hors d'oeuvres and laughed politely at some scripted joke about market trends. She had made small talk with a woman who turned out to be the contractor for the ballroom's renovations, exchanged a look with a teenager that suggested he might spill his drink, but she'd not expected him to make a spectacle of it. No one had expected anything, but social media expected spectacle the way weather expects wind. Now the spectacle was a call to action, and action was what Eleanor had been stockpiling for years in legal pads. They did not, at first, imagine a national story. They imagined something quieter, a lawyer, a local reporter, an inquiry. But the first rule of leverage is that small things, when placed on the right fulcrum, can move very large weights. By midnight, a small team of journalists had pieced together the edges of what Eleanor had described. Sarah Chen and Marcus Rodriguez, who had spent years following corporate philanthropy into the places where law and charity blurred, exchanged messages that read like flares. The files had the kind of specificity that made their backs go cold. Dates with internal memos that matched transfers, vendor invoices with duplicate entries, names of shell companies that appeared in both corporate supply lists and in personal property purchases registered under proxies. There were also quieter things. Notes about staffing patterns that suggested discrimination, emails that hinted at a culture of patronage and tokenism, memos that cataloged payments to groups that were never publicized. "A whistleblower?" Marcus asked on the line. "An old housekeeper and a trash can of receipts," Sarah replied. "But the receipts line up." When Sandra Holt saw the first reliable confirmation, she stopped writing for a moment and read the thread again. Sandra had built her career on stories that looked like clean crimes but turned out to be messy human things. A CEO who misused a trust fund, a nonprofit that spent more on events than services. She understood the narrative geometry of this. A humiliating moment boiling into public outrage, a person with principle, documentation that promised to turn outrage into accountability. And she knew the other half of the story, how quick power is to hit back. Inside Harrington House, Gregory Harrington stood in his private study with his wife and his counsel, hair thinner at the temples than it had been a year ago. The room smelled of tobacco and books. The portrait of the company's founder watched with the dispassionate eye of a man whose likeness had been commissioned by himself. "They filmed our son," Melissa said. Her voice held a different kind of strain from her husband's. She had been in that ballroom longer than most of the guests, and she knew how to read the ripple of trouble as a temperature. "They're making it a cause." Gregory's handshake had always ironed out problems. Tonight it crumpled into a fist. "This is a boy," he said. "A child. It will blow over." Devin Shaw, the PR director who had been with the company 10 years and prided himself on managing narrative weather systems, moved to the phone like a man who had been given a map. "We control the message," he said. "We always control the message." Marisol Trent, their chief legal counsel, did not look at the phone. She looked at the file Devin set down on the table, a printed screen of the night's viral clip with timestamp annotations. "Control is one thing," she said. "But this is different. There are documents in circulation. Someone's keeping records. If we do not act precisely, they will force our hand." Their conversations threaded the same needle. Public apology, private containment, a note about youthful misbehavior, donations to support the waitstaff, some mixture of performative charity and legal-facing language. But the ledger Eleanor had produced was not just a moral indictment. It hinted at malfeasance with cash flow consequences. That was a different problem entirely. The company prepared a statement to be released before sunrise. It would be conciliatory on the surface and direct underneath. This was a regrettable incident perpetrated by a minor, they would say. They would talk about supporting staff. Then they would pivot to the larger, more familiar Harrington narrative, philanthropy, jobs, educational programs, and ask the public to see the company's totality. That was the usual playbook. They would not, however, prepare for the speed of withdrawal. By 2 a.m, 2 of the banks that had been slated to move the next tranche for the Harrington Titanium Partnership sent terse emails to the company's CFO. Please hold. One of the board members called Gregory directly from a city far away and said he had received an unusual call, an intermediary on behalf of an investor, suggesting that reputational risk required reassessment. The investor's name was not given on the call. It took 2 more emails before Devin heard the name that made his mouth go dry. Vincenzo Moretti, publicly a financier with a portfolio of legitimate holdings and privately a man the papers had once described, in an article with oblique sourcing, as having ties to less savory circles. The papers had stopped short of naming him a criminal. Contemporary headlines liked the term, the Mafia Boss, as a fold of sensational shorthand. Moretti's publicists often issued denials and then filed libels. He was powerful and willing to be so in shadow. Hours after the wine stain went viral, a terse note crossed from Moretti's counsel to Harrington's legal team. In light of recent events, the investor had decided to reassess his commitment. Language like reputational prudence and market sensitivity appeared in the email. It did not directly say the $650 million pledge was withdrawn. It suggested a pause pending a comprehensive review. Still, in boardrooms, a pause is a withdrawal until proven otherwise. The public narrative, compartmentalized and easy to digest, was not what had actually happened. The private one was a stack of risk models being rerun overnight, senior partners waking and deciding the calculus had changed. The bank's APIs began to flag transfers as tentative. Internally, the company's head of corporate finance messaged the CEO. Liquidity concerns might be temporary, he wrote, but the models were fragile. The $650 million did not evaporate into thin air. It was rendered inert as decisions moved down a chain. By dawn, journalists following the leak were connecting dots and framing headlines. Major investor pauses $650 million deal after Harrington gala clip. The phrase, the Mafia Boss pulls back, trended in less reputable corners, and the papers that liked a sensational name printed Moretti's photograph, tan, smooth, eyes like polished stone, beneath a headline that suggested he had closed a door. Aya learned of the investor's hesitation, the way most people learned of anything now, through a notification that buzzed in her pocket as she sat on the stoop outside the service entrance. A push alert read, Market shock, major investor pauses $650 million. She stared at the words until the letters blurred. The news feeds that followed were a fever. Opinion pieces, think pieces, patrons calling for calm and reckoning by the same breath. Her phone kept buzzing with messages, supportive notes from regulars she served at Sunday brunch, a string of texts from an aunt in Atlanta who called to say people were talking. Someone had already made a GoFundMe link that raised small sums and thousands of comments aggressive for a woman they'd never met in real life. There were immediate tactical choices. Sarah Chen and Marcus Rodriguez had the documents Eleanor had provided. They were careful about chain of custody. They made verified copies and locked the originals in a bank's safety deposit box after photographing each page with timestamps and hashes. Sandra Holt wrote a short initial piece that balanced the viral clip's moral outrage with the new financial document's gravity. When humiliation becomes the hinge of something larger, she wrote in a line that would be quoted often later, it is not a trivial matter. The Harrington PR machine, which had been effective for decades, found itself reacting instead of shaping. Devin's first instinct was to drown the viral outrage in goodwill measures, an immediate gift to the evening staff, a public apology that would be warm enough to heal and chilly enough to protect the Harrison brand. They prepared footage of the family handing over checks to community programs, carefully cut to show laughter and sober, contrition-adjacent smiles. But then a different lever was proposed. If the narrative shifted away from the boys' act and toward a supposedly unstable waitress who made a scene for attention, maybe the conversation would dissipate. It was the kind of calculus old PR men made in smoke-filled rooms when they wanted to blunt a story's energy. Devon instructed a vendor in the night to scan search histories, assemble a dossier for character context, and look for anything that could suggest motive. Marisol pushed back. "We cannot weaponize a private citizen the way we weaponize corporations," she said. "There are legal and moral costs." Gregory's voice was sharper. "We can't let our company die on a viral video," he said. "We will do what it takes to stabilize our partners." There was a third response once the files began to float: confusion, fear, and the urge to find a scapegoat. The company did not yet know where Eleanor had found the records. Someone suggested an inside leak. Someone else suspected a vendetta. Gregory demanded names, and the executive assistant produced a list of employees who had access to the old safe. Conversations began to resemble an investigation without the comfort of formal authority. A quick sweep. An assertion of control. At the same time, Aya and the journalist convened to figure out what to do with the evidence Eleanor had given them. There were corridors of negotiations, attorneys laying out risks, reporters evaluating which items were strongest, a small, guarded meeting in the back of a diner where corners had been reserved, and water brought in flasks like holy offerings. "Why me?" Aya asked, not rhetorically. She had been a waitress for 10 years. She had never run for office, never sought the spotlight. Her life worked in rhythms of shifts, school pickups for nieces, and bills that aligned only occasionally. Eleanor's eyes were bright. "You were there," she said. "You carried yourself like you had dignity. And that's all it takes sometimes. People will stand behind dignity if you show them what belongs to them." They did not speak in the catechistic language of heroism. They talked in practicalities: safe transfer, press embargoes, witness protection if necessary, the need to verify chain of custody. Marisol insisted a neutral forensic team be engaged to validate the authenticity of the documents. The journalists called Dr. Sarah Walsh, a digital forensics expert, with a reputation for meticulous analyses and a disdain for theatrics. Dr. Walsh agreed, on condition that she receive direct access to both the originals and any digital artifacts connected to them. "If this is going to be credible," she said, "we have to make sure the paper is paper, the ink is ink, and the files are what they purport to be. No hearsay. Forensics tolerates nothing less." For Aya, consenting to be the face of the story was not an act of bravado. It was a decision about how to place her dignity into a public ledger. She could have walked away and let the humiliating clip be an anecdote by morning. She could have called for quiet and asked the world to forgive a boy's mistake. But standing still as a spectacle had been normal for so long, and she had reached a point where being silent felt like the lesser of evils. "I won't lie," she told the reporters. "But I don't want this to be about me. If this is about the truth behind the company, then you take the documents and prove it." As dawn gave way to a cold, indifferent morning, a new threat approached from a vector more pernicious than a child's prank: fabrication. By 9, a 6-minute clip circulated that purported to show Aya in a downtown bar the night before the gala, intoxicated and unpredictable. It was captioned with a line that left no room for nuance. "See how she behaves when the cameras aren't on." The clip was grainy, apparently taken by a phone, and in the split screen the sound was doctored to include a slurred line that altered her sentence into a confession. Small inconsistencies nagged the edges of the file, an odd reflection in a mirror that didn't line up with the angle, flickers of film grain in odd places. The clip felt like a trap laid to strip her of moral authority. Devon supplied the clip to press outlets with an immediate release. New evidence of the waitress's behavior publicly shows this was a setup for sympathy, We can no longer accept allegations based on a single viral moment. The company suggested the clip proved the narrative had been manufactured by unnamed agitators. The doctored video did what such things do. It shifted the emotional framing. Supporters shagged their shields to block new accusations. Trolls ramped up. Aya's personal messages darkened with threats and insults. The family members cited in Eleanor's records when called by reporters gave cryptic denials. Others asked for privacy. Preston's school officials called the episode a regrettable lapse in judgment and announced counseling for him. There was no justifiable depth in the response that matched the allegations he had provoked. He was a child in every legal sense, and the community felt a reflexive need to protect its minors. The doctored clip created two simultaneous currents, one of immediate reputational damage and one of institutional exposure. The banks had already moved toward a pause. Now they began to ask for clarifications about public relations risks and the viability of the partnership. Moretti's little reassessment memo, never meant to be public, was quoted in a new column that argued investors could not stomach the risk of contamination. Share prices, which had been steady, took a hesitant dip as trading desks adjusted positions. At the diner table, the journalists looked at each other and then at Aya. "They're attacking you," Marcus said. "They're trying to make you the noise." "They're trying to make truth into rumor," Sarah added. "But the documents, if they hold up, are a different kind of noise. They have to be louder." Aya felt the ground beneath her belief in the system give a small, disorienting tremor. It was one thing to be humiliated by a teenager's theatrics. It was another to have the truth tangled in a net of manufactured images. She called Eleanor and found the woman at home, folding sheets into the careful squares of a life that had often been measured in public slights and private victories. "You don't have to be the face," Eleanor said, not asking. Her voice had an edge, like a blade been used too long but still serviceable. "But if you walk away now, they will make you into whatever they want." "I feel tired," Aya said. She had words about dignity and justice and a wish to be more ordinary, but none of them fit across the table. "I'm not sure I'm ready for what comes next." The journalists worked through a checklist. Dr. Walsh would need time to run tests on the paper and the ink, spectrometry, watermark analysis, and cross-references with the company's internal letterhead. They needed to confirm anomalies within the ledgers, serial numbers, authorization codes, time-stamped emails that provided a digital breadcrumb trail. Sarah arranged for the photocopies to be mirrored into encrypted drives. Marcus started the slow, patient work of contacting vendors listed on the ledgers to ask, neutrally, about payments they had received. Meanwhile, inside Harrington House, the plan had shifted from mitigation to counteroffensive. A vendor was paid to assemble contextual footage, clips that suggested Aya had a pattern of disruptive behavior. An anonymous smear site published a montage claiming to show inconsistencies in her story. Devin called it damage control. Marisol called it a hazard. At the center of both sides, Aya and the Harringtons, was an uncomfortable truth. Institutions knew how to move with coordinated precision. They had lawyers, PR specialists, access to vendors who could generate material at a moment's notice. A single person with a folder of papers and a battered notebook did not appear, on paper, to be an opponent with the machinery to match those forces. But small competitions sometimes take place not on equal footing, but on something else: resolve, and the capacity to attach evidence to it. At noon, the initial story broke more fully. Sandra's piece appeared with careful caveats and a clear, accessible line that would be echoed on broadcasts. What began as an apparent act of public humiliation now intersects with documents suggesting systemic financial misdirection at the heart of a powerful conglomerate. The piece included images of the ledger pages and an interview clip with Eleanor, her hands steady as she described the boxed records she had long kept. The piece also noted the possibility of a counterattack. A newly circulated clip that purported to show Aya in a compromising light and the company's immediate call for calm. Public reaction bifurcated. There were protests outside the Harrington ballroom, picket signs waved by activists who saw in Aya's humiliation a microcosm of what they had been fighting for. There were also calls from conservative talkers to wait for due process, to defend the Harrington family's contributions to civic life. The commentary cycle, as always, favored speed over subtlety. Somewhere in the blur, a trending hashtag gathered momentum. Dignity, not drama. When the first formal query landed on the boardroom table, an anonymous whistleblower alert to federal regulators, the legal strategy shifted from defense to containment. A ledger implies intent in ways that are slow to disprove. Moretti's reassessment had been public enough to cause the market to twitch. Private investors asked their own counsel whether a pause meant indefinite suspension. A pause, the CFO repeated, was enough to ripple through cash flow models. Employees at satellite offices called human resources, frightened about continuity plans. Contractors asked for assurances. At 3 o'clock, a terse statement went out from Moretti's offices. The investor was committed to the highest standards of ethical governance and would temporarily pause any disbursements to preserve the integrity of ongoing inquiries. The publicists framed it as a prudent step. The phrase Mafia Boss ends $650 million deal slid like an arrow through public feeds in less reputable corners, and soon the more serious outlets were trying to explain the mechanics. A pause, the paper said, was not an indictment, but it meant the capital offered to the Harrington Titanium Partnership would not be available in the timeline the company had planned. That was, in practical terms, the same thing as taking the money off the table. Aya watched the market alert out of the corner of her screen and felt a sensation like vertigo. A small, decisive action taken by a powerful man she had never met had effectively canceled a future that had already been modeled and budgeted. The humiliation of the wine spill, ridiculous, petty, cruel, had, in an odd chain of events, become the hinge that shuttered an entire transaction. She thought of the fundraising the gala had been meant to anchor, and of the ways the Harrington name moved through philanthropy like a heavy hand. She thought of Eleanor and her ledger, of the quiet diligence of someone who had tucked the truth into a broom closet because that was what the job allowed. She thought of Preston, a boy whose hand had been judged less for its violence than for its indifference, and of the way institutions sometimes turned the small, messy things of the world into leverage. For the first time in her life, she understood, viscerally, the power of documentation. A series of handwritten dates, held by a woman who remembered every month a check had been misdirected, and who decided to keep the evidence. But the story did not belong to her alone. It belonged also to the people who held the power to validate it. Forensics experts, journalists meticulous in their sifting, lawyers who understood discovery, and the public who might choose to demand accountability. It also belonged to the people who would rather keep the world as it had been, comfortable for some, precarious for others. That contingency was now playing out in real time. Investors hedging, PR teams spinning, activists organizing. It felt, to Aya, like a war between tacticians and conscience. The first day ended without arrests, without formal charges, but with new lines drawn on maps. The Harrington board met behind closed doors. The CFO sent quiet memos to senior partners about contingency liquidity. Marisol prepared for the possibility of regulatory inquiries and issued litigator-level warnings to people who might leak. Dr. Walsh had scheduled the first forensic analysis for the earliest convenient slot. The journalists prepared a fuller packet for their editors, annotated and verified and boxed for public consumption at the right moment. Meanwhile, Aya sat on the steps outside a church near the train line where she used to volunteer, and let the world do what it does best: talk loudly without listening. Every time a car passed, the satellite speakers inside the vehicle carried the cadence of someone else's certainty. She tucked her notebook into her coat like a talisman and pressed the small paper bundle closer to her chest. It contained something more fragile than paper, proof that someone had been keeping a ledger of wrongs. A teenager had spilled wine on her and laughed. Less than 24 hours later, an investor with a media label and a guarded reputation had pressed a button and effectively pulled a $650 million commitment into the shadows. The magnitude of that leap, a child's impulse to an investor's retraction, felt like evidence of a larger truth. Power, when challenged by the optics of cruelty, reacted quickly to preserve itself. Aya had not anticipated the immediacy of the change. She had not imagined that one public humiliation would echo into boardrooms and bank vaults. She had not expected that the night would finish with more than a smear piece or an apology. And she had not expected that an old woman with a ledger could hold, in those pages, the potential to turn a social spectacle into a legal question. By early evening, reporters were calling with questions about the ledger's chain of custody. Security queried Aya about the original documents. The Harringtons' legal team sent a letter demanding to know who had accessed their basement safe. Someone from Moretti's staff asked his counsel whether the pause on funds could be made permanent if the headlines did not subside. A smear site published more footage and more accusations. Social media did what it always did best. It amplified the noise until the signal was hard to find. Aya made a decision she had not planned to make. She would not hide. She would sit for an interview on one of the morning networks and tell the truth she could tell, the facts of the night, the outline of her life, and the existence of the documents. She would not, she understood, be sufficient on her own. She would be one witness among many. The details she now recognized were the true currency. That night, as lights of the city blinked like distant stars, she sat on the edge of a bench beneath a street lamp and looked at the papers in her bag. Eleanor had a way of making the past feel present. The ledger's dates were a roadmap of small, deliberate transfers. Whoever had written those marginalia had been patient. Whomever had kept them had been patient too. The patience of a housekeeper cataloging wrongs was a different breed of endurance than the patience of a polished executive who wrote checks to change an image. Both were endurance. One stacked evidence in drawers, the other stacked influence in ledgers. Aya thought about what the coming days would require. Cross-checks, legal counsel, witness statements. She thought about Preston's lit asynchronous shrug, and about the Harrington world's capacity to weaponize dignity into an asset. She felt, in a place at the center of her chest, the pressure of an unmade choice. To step forward meant to be beset from all sides. To step back meant the ledger might be dismissed as the work of a disgruntled insider, and the corporate machine would spin into place around the same old narratives. She rose from the bench and walked to her shift. The gala had been a glittering set that night. Now, in the raw cold, the same ballroom felt like a crime scene in slow motion. She moved through the rows of tables like someone who had been asked to occupy a space on more than one front: service and conscience, anonymity and public witness. The friends who greeted her at the back door told small tales of good customers and bad tips, of lives that ran on the narrow groove of shifts and paychecks. None of them wanted a headline. All of them wanted balance. At the edge of the kitchen, someone left a note taped to the wall. "Dignity isn't a card, it's action." It could have been a motivational poster. Aya thought of that line for a long time that night. Dignity is not an answer. It is a method. It is a decision to refuse to be made into someone else's entertainment. Somewhere in the city, a technician at a boutique firm that produced PR assets was running a clip through software. The clip showed the night at the bar, supposedly implicating Aya. He adjusted color curves, changed the audio splice, and exported a version that smoothed the edges of the original. He did not think of the person in the clip as a human being. He thought of the clip as a deliverable. The deliverable would be placed, later, into a chain of deniability. In the newsroom, Dr. Walsh slept for an hour on a pullout and dreamed of spreadsheets. Her morning would be the long, patient work of comparison: ink under ultraviolet light, typeface analysis, metadata extraction from scanned attachments. The digital trails were often the weakest link for those who tried to hide illicit transfers. People who cooked the books rarely imagined someone would look at the reflection in a glass and use it to prove the footage wrong. They rarely accounted for how clumsy their edits could be under the scrutiny of an expert who could measure the way light bent across a polished brass knob and deduce where the camera really was. The next morning was coming, and pockets of the city divided themselves into camps. Those who saw in Aya a symbol of the small humiliations no one wanted in print, and those who saw her as an opportunist, gaming a narrative for personal gain. Between those poles, investigators, journalists, and counsel moved with careful steps. The ledger went into an encrypted drive. A forensic lab scheduled its work. The company's counsel called for a comprehensive response plan. The public, who had watched a video of a woman's dignity assaulted, watched now an unraveling that connected sentiment to dollars to questions about who owed what to whom. At the center of it all was the girl who had been spilled upon. People had laughed as wine ran down her dress. Hours later, an investor with power and a reputation had removed the engine of a $650 million deal. The result was not yet justice and not yet relief. It was, for a time, a battleground. The morning after the market alert, Dr. Sarah Walsh arrived at the newsroom with a duffel bag that smelled faintly of disinfectant and solder. She moved as if a ritual had steadied her. Black coat, no jewelry that could catch light, a small digital recorder and a tablet in her hand. She had spent years turning pixels into testimony, and that day the pixels needed translation into a language the public could understand. The journalists cleared a conference room and set up a live feed that would cut across morning shows. The plan was simple and terrifying. Show what the company had manufactured and explain in plain terms how to prove it. Emily, a young technician with an eye for detail, ran the first comparison clips. Side by side, the downtown bar footage and a verified clip from the bar's own security camera sat on the screen. At first glance, they looked similar. A woman at the bar, people milling, a noise that could be read as laughter. Then Sarah guided the room like a patient surgeon. "Look at the brass handrail behind the bar at 023, she said. "Now look at the reflection in the grain of the wood above the sink at 023 in the uploaded clip." She used a digital annotation to circle a narrow sliver of light. The reflection's vanishing point doesn't line up with the camera's perspective in the verified footage. That means the clip is a composite. Whoever made it left a physical impossibility. She spoke about metadata the way others spoke about weather. Predictable, measurable. The uploaded file bore the hallmarks of recompression, a new container format, modified timestamps, and stripped XF headers. In lay terms, the clip had been re-encoded and re-exported. Someone had tried to fasten new meaning onto old pixels. They had altered audio to make a sentence sound slurred. A waveform overlay showed an abrupt cut that didn't match natural speech inflection. The doctored frames bore double edges where cuts had been made, ghosting that betrayed the edit. One frame contained a photographer's reflection in a spoon that, when traced, placed the camera 6 feet to the left of where it should have been. It was a mistake born of haste, not malice, but it was enough. The room of journalists watched as Sarah stitched a narrative. The verified CCTV did not contain the incriminating scene. Timestamps from the bar's security server and the door log placed the woman in a chair across the room at the alleged moment of offending speech. The audio track stitched into the viral clip had been lifted from a different time and layered in. "This is not an error," Sarah said. "This is a construction." The live feed that afternoon cut between Sarah's technical readouts and Eleanor Reed's steady voice in an interview. The old housekeeper held up a worn piece of paper and read a date aloud while the ledger page appeared beside her on screen. The camera lingered on the penciled margins, the way one line crossed another to redirect funds. It was not a singular scandal, it was a pattern. Public reaction, which had been fractious and noisy, consolidated into a new note: scrutiny. Editors who had been cautious until then suddenly corralled resources. Investigative units in 3 networks pooled their access to bank records and shell company registries. A legal team representing Aya and the journalists prepared a submission for a federal regulator. The presence of clearly falsified material changed the terms of the fight. When evidence of intentional fabrication exists, the presumption of mere rumor gives way to a formal inquiry. Harrington's response frayed into slippage. Devon called a press strategy meeting and found that his usual levers no longer controlled the room. Board members, hearing the words fabrication and digital forensics, sent terse messages asking for tempered statements. Marisol advised caution. Any narrative that suggests we had a hand in manufacturing material will necessarily bring regulators into the picture. We must be careful with language. Gregory paced his study and spoke less to his counsel and more to his legacy portrait. He asked how to stitch back a family name that had been designed for permanence. The banks that had once hovered, checking boxes and recalculating risk, had already moved farther than the PR team realized. Their risk assessments were automated to a point. Their middle offices flagged anomalies in public filings and press hits, and their decision trees pushed hold and escalate faster than a human hand could withdraw funds. By the time Devon crafted a polite memo about unverified material circulating online, the financial machinery had already frozen additional contingencies. Credit lines drew closer to covenants. The second tranche of the $650 million, which had been scheduled for release on a Tuesday morning, received a mechanical pending status. Then came the subpoena. It arrived at noon, delivered by a federal agent with a folder and a badge. The language was dry, the wheels of authority grinding slowly but inexorably. An inquiry into potential financial crimes, requests for communications, immediate preservation orders. The Harrington Council read the first pages and felt the temperature change. When regulators form the language of a subpoena, they do not whisper. They create paper that insists on compliance. Moretti's office released a terse statement saying nothing direct about culpability. The statement emphasized prudence and interest in an orderly market. But the press, which had been hungry for simpler narratives, had an easier bite. Mafia Boss ends $650 million deal. It made for better headlines than investor pauses pending review. Colonies of commentary assembled overnight arguing whether Moretti was prudent or self-serving. The difference mattered less in practical terms than one fact. Without his funds, and without the bank's confidence, the partnership could not proceed on its timetable. Federal agents executed search warrants at Harrington Tower that week. They were methodical and clinical. Evidence technicians in gloves, cataloging tag numbers, servers removed from racks, secure bags labeled and sealed. Cameras that once framed the founder's portrait now recorded chain of custody entries. Agents carried boxes into trucks with the gravity of harvesters taking in ripe, dangerous fruit. Arrests followed. They were surgical and specific. A head of procurement, a middle-level finance officer whose signatures lined a dozen suspicious transfers, and an outside consultant who had set up shell companies years earlier. The men and women led away were not caricatures. They were administrators and professionals who had learned to navigate a system that rewarded ambiguity. None of the arrests, at that early stage, were verdicts. They were steps in a legal process that might prove guilt or might reveal incompetence at scale. The newsroom took care to phrase every string with the conditional nuance that law requires. Officials arrested on suspicion of fraud and conspiracy. Yet for the public, the image was potent. The Harrington offices, once a symbol of curated goodwill, now held boxes and sealant tape, and men in suits entering SUVs with government license plates. Moretti, whose name had floated like a specter over the story, issued one more statement, short, formal, non-committal. In light of ongoing inquiries, he said through counsel, our firm will not move forward with the previously contemplated disbursement. The phrasing allowed his team to avoid an explicit admission or rejection of responsibility, but it carried the functional force of a withdrawal. The deal, in practice, collapsed. Aya watched the sequence on a loop of news segments in the living room of a friend who had become a home base. The city outside moved as it always did, deliveries, buses, conversations on stoops. But inside, her phone was a small, relentless instrument of history. Messages of support kept coming, along with the usual undercurrent of nastiness that the internet supplies with indifferent efficiency. She slept no more than an hour at a time. Fatigue became an ache in her teeth. Preston's family released a statement. They expressed regret and promised to take responsibility appropriate to a child's development. The Harringtons arranged counseling and withdrew the boy from the public eye. School officials implemented behavioral interventions and a restorative session in which Preston would be required to meet with members of the hospitality staff and listen to their stories. It was, the school put it gently, a teaching moment. The shift in public attention from the humiliating clip to the ledger and the fabricated footage had an emotional cost for Aya. The smear campaign had sought to make her unreliable, and while the forensics weakened the smear, the strategy had left stain marks of its own. Threats and hateful messages arrived via phone. Her home address was posted and quickly taken down. At one point, someone attempted to file a bogus criminal complaint. She learned early about the way people can weaponize narrative to exact private harm. Still, what swelled in the wake of the legal instruments was not merely a wave of punitive measures. There emerged a movement to protect people like Eleanor who had kept records in basements and wardrobes and attic boxes for years, often because they had no institutional recourse. Journalists, lawyers, and activists began to talk not just about prosecutions, but about systems. Payroll transparency, third-party oversight, whistleblower protections that extended beyond token anonymity. A coalition formed with surprising speed. Sandra Holt convened a call with a set of donors and executives sympathetic to reform. A philanthropic foundation offered seed money for a protection fund. A civil rights group suggested a legal framework for safe harbor for witnesses who came forward with protected evidence. Aya found herself at many of those tables. The one-time waitress had been a reluctant public figure, but her presence now mattered. Her questions were practical. How would witnesses be protected? Who would pay legal costs? How would evidence be authenticated without exposing communities to risk? Eleanor Reed became a focal point. Her ledger was not the only document, but it was the one that made a narrative into a pattern. She received visitors, reporters, civil rights attorneys who wanted to be sure she would not be left to shoulder legal costs alone, and a small municipal councilwoman who wanted to publicly acknowledge the utility of ordinary people keeping records of the everyday. The housekeeper's hands, which had once been held out for tips, were now presented with checks and offers of assistance. She took none of the money for herself. Instead, she insisted the ledger be the seed for something larger. "This can't end with us," she said. "People who keep the truth should not be punished for it." The press conference where Dr. Walsh presented the forensic findings live was a turning point. She did not grandstand. She explained that the doctored video bore a fingerprint of sloppiness, an overlooked reflection, a misaligned timestamp, an audio splice. She showed side-by-side frames and walked viewers through what the inconsistencies meant. The language she used demystified the work without flattening it. If you take light and force it into a shape that doesn't belong to that room, you're forcing a lie to wear a room's clothes. The metaphor landed. People could see, in the graphics on their screens, evidence that could be understood without a law degree. That shift in perception mattered in boardrooms and courtrooms. Investors who had once tolerated reputational risk for a return now faced a new calculus. Their advisors sent memos that said in different words that associations with narrative manipulation were long-term threats to portfolio value. The partnership that had depended on both capital and trust had lost one of its two pillars. On the legal side, the presence of falsified evidence opened fresh lines of inquiry. Investigators subpoenaed the company's PR vendors and a list of third-party producers. Records showed payments for content packages and image management. Some of those vendors had provided plausible deniability. Others had left behind digital breadcrumbs that investigators traced to servers associated with consultancy accounts. The auditors began to follow payments into shell entities whose ownership was obscured behind layers of nominee directors. Each layer lifted revealed another. There were arrests and there were settlements, There were board members coerced into retirement and an emergency meeting where Gregory Harrington announced he would step down as CEO pending the results of the inquiries. The board appointed an interim executive, someone who had not been part of the family lineage, who came with a reputation for transparency and a checklist of governance reforms. The media called it forced renewal. Critics called it overdue. Moretti, whose name had been a specter hovering outside of legal certainty, had a modest portfolio to protect. He was not a protagonist in the newsroom's moral arc. He was an actor in an ecosystem. When federal investigators widened their requests to include intermediaries associated with his investments, his counsel made a pragmatic decision: distance. A publicist's statement withdrawing the funds and disclaiming further engagement held the practical effect of ending the $650 million deal. Whether Moretti had direct knowledge of every discrepancy in the Harrington ledgers mattered less to markets than the optics of association with scandal. The headline, "The Mafia Boss Ends $650 million Deal," had been crude shorthand for a cascade of investor caution that closed the project's funding window. As the investigations unfolded, Aya and Eleanor did something that surprised some who followed the story. They moved not toward retribution, but toward institution building. They had both seen what the ledger had done and what the absence of protection for keepers of truth had permitted. With the support of donors, a coalition of journalists, and a handful of legal advocates, they announced the formation of the Morton Reed Institute for Witness Protection and Corporate Transparency. The institute was modest at first: an office suite in a converted building, a code of practice for receiving and authenticating documents, a pool of emergency legal funds, and a secure channel for whistleblowers to route their evidence with chain-of-custody protections. The vision was specific: reduce the barrier for ordinary people who keep records, so that evidence of abuse or fraud could be preserved and presented without exposing those keepers to immediate legal or social peril. The Institute's charter included training for investigators and protections for journalists who would act as intermediaries. It was the sort of architecture that dreamed of reducing future Harrington-style collapses into observable, preventable things. Founding the Institute did not make Aya whole. The fatigue and the moments of fear lingered. The harassment tapered but did not vanish. She still woke to alerts and headlines. But she had agency. She could shape a response that would outlast a news cycle. The press, which had helped break the ledger into the light, now covered the Institute's launch with an eye for symbolism. Donors arrived: a quiet philanthropic trust, a group of labor organizers, a small assembly of hospitality workers who came to represent the many unnamed people who kept society's machinery running. Eleanor did not like the fuss, but she stood beside Aya on the dais and accepted the applause with the flat gratitude of someone who had been doing righteous labor in the dark for years. The legal fallout continued. Some executives faced indictment. Others negotiated plea deals that included cooperation with investigators. The company itself entered into settlement negotiations with regulators and agreed to a package of governance reforms: independent oversight, transparent payroll audits, and a mandatory whistleblower channel routed externally. The interim CEO appointed a compliance officer and publicly pledged to return institutional trust. The company's donors and partner organizations, who had once enjoyed quiet access to influence, now faced public scrutiny and the need to demonstrate that their investments served public good as advertised. As those processes unfolded, smaller, quieter things began to shift. The hospitality staff at Harrington House received additional benefits. The company reopened conversations about fair wage practices in offices across the city. Some vendors were audited and found to have been unwitting conduits, while others bore responsibility and were removed from the network. Preston, the boy whose elbow had begun the sequence, entered counseling and community service that emphasized listening and restitution. His family issued a private apology to the staff and committed to educational stipends for hospitality workers' children. That did not rewrite the moment of cruelty, but it acknowledged it and sought to make amends. Months later, an event arranged as a fundraiser and a formal reopening of the ballroom where the wine had first spilled, gathered people in a kind of fragile reconciliation. The chandelier still gleamed. The peach silk reminded people of the wide arc of the story. There were calls beforehand. Some people said they could not attend. Some said they were nervous. But the evening had been planned to honor dignity rather than to stage a spectacle. Eleanor could not attend the entire night. She had grown tired more quickly than she once did. She sat at the edge of the room, a small, plain woman amid ornate decor, and listened to guests speak of accountability, of reform, and of the Institute's mission. Aya received an award that evening, a modest plaque, and a few words from a journalist who had covered the case from the beginning. The applause felt strange to her. She had not sought limelight. But she had led involuntarily, and now she used that space to speak about everyday courage. "In one ledger and one lady's patience," she said to the room, "we found a map of how wrongs were paid for and covered up. It was not clever. It was paperwork. The lesson is simple. Keep receipts for the right reasons and preserve them. Let the world know that keeping truth is not a crime." Her voice did not tremble. She looked at the family who listened from the back, at the Harringtons who had come but kept their distance, and at the people who had stood outside the ballroom months before with signs demanding dignity. She looked, too, at the journalists who had refused easy narratives, and at Dr. Walsh, who had given the public a vocabulary for seeing a lie. The Institute's launch was not the end of accountability. Legal processes continued. Trials would, in some cases, not lead to convictions, and in others would. Settlement dollars flowed into remedial funds. The company agreed to community-based oversight panels with worker representatives and independent auditors. These changes did not erase what had happened. They institutionalized a way to reduce its chance of recurrence. Aya's life settled, eventually, into a new rhythm. She kept waiting tables for a while, not because she had to, but because she wanted to stay connected to the people who had been with her at the start. She had offers of work in more public-facing roles, speaking engagements, an advisory role at the Institute. But she chose projects that allowed for ordinary life. Niece's school concerts, a Sunday dinner with family, the comfort of a place where people were known by name rather than by headline. She still carried the battered notebook and sometimes opened it to find Eleanor's marginalia, a reminder of the humble ways that truth can accumulate. Eleanor passed 2 years after the scandal first erupted, in a small apartment that smelled of lemon oil and starch. Her funeral was attended by people who had once been quiet faces in the service corridor and by a smattering of journalists. At the gravesite, Aya put a single ledger page into the folded hands of the woman she had loved like a mentor. "You kept us honest," she whispered. "You kept us counted." The city remembered the incident, but not as a single viral moment. It remembered the ledger, the headaches of governance, and the institute that tried to make it safer for people who did the small, important work of keeping track. The Harrington name survived in altered form. Its logo was still on buildings but accompanied by the reality of oversight. The markets shuffled assets around. Moretti's withdrawal became a case study in investor risk management. A reporter who had covered the case from the beginning asked Aya in a late interview what she thought had changed. Aya thought of the panes of glass that had reflected the false footage and the way one misaligned glint had told truth from fiction. "People who were not meant to be seen began to be visible," she said. "Not because of me, but because someone recorded the receipts and kept them. Too often the work of keeping track is assumed unromantic. It isn't. It's the thing that bends the arc of accountability." Eleanor showed that. There were nights still, when she replayed the first seconds of the clip, the wine hitting the apron, Preston's indifferent shrug, and felt a cold flash. But those images were tempered by the knowledge that the moment had not been merely consumable spectacle. It had been the hinge for something else, a way to reframe how institutions behaved when the optics turned public. At the Institute's annual forum, Aya sat on a panel with Dr. Walsh and a representative from a federal oversight body. They discussed chain of custody protocols, encrypted handoffs, and the ethics of protection. The audience listened. Nonprofit lawyers, hospitality staff, young students of journalism. Someone in the crowd stood and asked how ordinary people could make sure their records mattered. Aya told them to take care of the particulars: dates, witnesses, copies, and trusted intermediaries. She spoke about the warmth of a ledger page in Eleanor's hands and the flat DNA of a well-kept receipt. The practicalities were not flashy. They were precise and available to anyone who cared to know. Years after the wine had stained peach silk, the ballroom reopened officially under a new committee that included worker representatives and community members. The chandelier gleamed as it once had, but now it illuminated a room governed by new rules. On the evening the room was rededicated, Aya walked through wearing a simple dress and carrying a small box. Inside was the first deposit from the Institute, a check meant to seed a program providing emergency legal aid for service workers who encountered institutional abuse. She looked out over the crowd, some faces familiar, others new, and felt a tenderness that was not triumphalist. The story had been messy and ethical and legal and human. The man who had been labeled the Mafia Boss by early headlines had ended a $650 million commitment in public view, a move that, in the narrative economy of the event, provided the external pressure needed to expose a broader pattern. But beyond headlines and money and arrests, the enduring work was the creation of structures that made it harder for ledger pages to disappear into closets. Outside the ballroom, a cluster of hospitality workers from the night the wine had spilled lingered in the cool air and shared a quiet joke. Preston, older and quieter, volunteered sometimes at the Institute's youth outreach program as part of his restorative path. He spoke to groups about manners and consequence, about the strange ways privilege can translate into thoughtless action. He did not take any credit for the rest of the world having done its work. He apologized, privately and publicly, and he listened. At the end of the rededication ceremony, Aya took a slow walk across the ballroom floor. She stopped where the stain had been, in a space now polished and sober. The memory existed like a shadow, a single moment that moved into law, into policy, into institutions that could hold people up instead of letting them fall. She thought of Eleanor's ledger, of Dr. Walsh's patient diagrams, of the journalists who had chosen to verify rather than amplify, of the donors who had redirected funds toward structural change. She thought of the quiet office where the Institute kept its back channel for witnesses, of the secure server that held scanned pages in immutable hashes, and of the young technician who still sometimes dreamed of spreadsheets. In the end, the story was not about retribution alone. It was about the ways small acts of care, writing a receipt, keeping a ledger, refusing to laugh at someone else's misfortune, can ripple into public life. The instigator of the collapse of the $650 million deal had been a combination of forces: investor prudence, media scrutiny, legal instruments, public pressure, and the sudden, unforgiving clarity of forensic analysis. The label Mafia Boss had made for dramatic column inches, but the collapse had been procedural: funds withdrawn, regulatory wheels engaged, and the company left to reckon with its record. Aya stood under the chandelier and let the light fall the way it always had, a wash of brilliance that made everything visible. She did not need to be on a pedestal. She wanted the Institute to be the podium for others. She wanted a world where ledger pages found ears, where reflections in spoons could be traced by patient investigators, and where ordinary dignity was not a condition of applause, but an expectation of institutions. If this story moved you, like and subscribe. Check the 2 recommended stories on screen.